I'd like to introduce to you, from the Dorrigo Folk and Bluegrass Festival, the beautiful Megan Roweth with one of her original compositions. Welcome, Roweth family, to an otherwise quiet room at Dorrigo Music Festival.
Thank you, Mandy.
Thanks, Mandy.
You guys have this really distinctive voice, and it's been my complete pleasure. I haven't actually seen you in person yet, but to watch online you starting to recite poetry, Megan, it's just...
Yeah, I really picked up the habit from my dad. He started reciting poetry a few years ago, and he'd be walking up and down the hill every morning,
I did.
learning all these lovely poems. And then one day he comes home and he says, "I've got a great poem for you," and he recites the first verse. And then the next day, in the morning, he'll say, "Okay," and then he'll recite the first verse and the second verse. But the thing was, that was the perfect condition for me to pick up the poem.
Ah.
So he finished this poem, Walgett Town by Banjo Patterson. He finishes it up. And I recited it back at him and said, "Mine now." So and I've been doing it ever since.
Learning pace by pace, pacing each other.
Yeah, we were. Our first poetry gig was the same festival 6 years ago. I'd been on stage for a lot and telling stories and telling yarns, and poetry was not as big a step for me as it was for Megan. She was 6.
It's a pretty big achievement, and the poem you did first that's quite a telling. It's
Megan's always had I was speaking for her a little bit. I think she's always had an understanding of language above and beyond her years. She's surrounded by folkies. She's surrounded by the festival scene. She's got a million festival aunties and uncles and cousins, as well as our families. So she's surrounded by good speakers. Yeah.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about Dorrigo that we've been talking about is that it's a big melting pot of sounds, and we've been trying to get people talking about what the Australian sound means to them, but that's not always so easy. And some of the Americans particularly don't want to offend anyone, so they don't want to speak openly about what they're hearing, which is a real shame, because in private they're talking about all these gems. Yeah. But I think my favourite thing about your whole clan is your take on Australian culture and ownership of Australian sound. What do you like most about it?
I really think that if you're looking at the sound of Australian music, it's not so much any particular sound, but to me, I think it's the standing ovation that a first-timer gets at a poet's breakfast. Because I think that's the big thing about all this, that anyone can do it and anyone can have a go.
That's I've got to agree, that's a very Australian sound to me as well. There's a distinct cadence to a bush poem, I think.
Yeah, I've thought for a long time that I don't think it's a metaphysical thought to think that your environment, your room, your trees, the buildings you make, what you eat, what you drink, everything creates the music you make. So Australian music, it doesn't really matter what you intend. If you play music here long enough, well, it's going to develop a sound that's different subtly. Now there are kind of some specific examples like that. We built big halls here, so the fast tunes that worked in the small rooms in Ireland weren't so great. But here we had these wonderful big halls, or indeed dancing on the river flats, so the big steps and slow downs, and so the music slowed down to suit. That's just one example, but I think you could go on. Yeah.
I think space is incredibly important to forming sound and who we are.
We would not be making this sound if we were out there. We would.
That's why we call it an otherwise quiet room.
Room.
But Megan, would you please do us the honour of reciting a poem for our listeners?
All right. She should be at home with her mother. Instead, she rocks on the sea. Instead, she's far from her country, so far from where she should be. Most of her town will be gone now, smothered by guns and bombs. At least she's slightly safer here, though most of her home is still gone. Australia turned them away, and her home is just a wall. She just hopes that their boat doesn't sink, and that somebody opens the door.
Because I'm saying